Hello, everyone. How's everybody doing?
I just want to say aloha because I'm in Maui. That's how much I want to be with you guys.
I don't understand why I'm not there with you.
Well, you know, you just couldn't make it this time, but you'll come next time.
I have never been to Hawaii.
Oh, you need to go.
I've been to a lot of other places, but not Hawaii. It just never made it.
The sun and the surf. Well, it's gorgeous. We were in Oahu for about a week, and this week we're with friends here in Maui. So the islands are different. You choose your islands, and yeah. So if you ever want to go, talk to me about it.
I want to go tomorrow. Can I go tomorrow?
Tomorrow's good.
Tomorrow works for me.
Anyway, it's 9 o'clock in the morning here. So just wanted you to know this is my breakfast, lunch, and learn.
Oh, I love that. I love that you're enjoying your coffee out on the patio and
my tea. Yes, I am.
Very nice. Well, that sounds absolutely perfect.
Yeah, it's good.
All right, we got a couple more people coming in. Encourage you to turn on your cameras so we can see each other and feel like we're all together if you can. Hi, Roberta. Is that Marty too? Hi, Sharon and Susan. Hi. See, Chloe and Ben are here. Lori signing in.
Sharon's there.
A couple more people logging in. Anyone have any news, anything joyful to share, anything going on while we let our last couple people get ready? Other than being in Hawaii, I mean, that's pretty good.
That's pretty good.
Joyful, we're alive and here.
That's the best. Joy. That's number one, right?
Sure.
That's a good start. It's a good starting point.
Okay,
can you hear me now?
I can hear you. How are you?
I'm good. I just wanted to tell you that the National Association of Retired Rabbis had its conference this past weekend over Zoom.
Yes.
And they honored the classmates from 50 years ago who were then rabbis, for 50 years. But Sally Preisand, since she is one of them from that class, was honored by the class. And then Sally spoke. So it was really, really wonderful to be able to listen to her. And I'm glad she's going to be on next week.
Well, so you'll have to tell us after if she said the exact same thing or if she changes it up.
All right. We will tell you.
I mean, I'm assuming she's got kind of her shtick.
Maybe.
It's back to Zoom where I can see and I'm adjusting. Don't want to do that. All right, wonderful. Oh, well, so that's fantastic. And so maybe you can give us a little insight as we get started. So I'm just delighted to see everybody here. As Roberta just mentioned, next week we will be joined by Rabbi Sally Preisand, where she will be telling us her story. And my understanding is that when she tells her story, she also tells a bit of the story, one more person coming in, of Rabbi Regina Jonas or Regina Jonas, depending on your German accent. But we're going to be we're going to be studying her a bit today. So I'm going to let Sally know that we've already talked about her a little, but I'm sure she knows more than I do. So we will jump into that. A little bit of a recap from last time. Last week when we were together, we looked at what I've been calling proto-rabbis. At 3 different women who filled functions that were rabbinic in nature, doing things like giving divrei Torah, leading educational institutions, maybe offering some pastoral counseling in some cases, and both what was the support that they needed to have in order to be able to fill those roles in those early times. So just a reminder, we looked at Ray Frank, the girl rabbi of the Golden West in the 1800s, kind of San Francisco and upwards and outwards in the West, who really did a lot of teaching and drashing. We looked at, oh gosh, I'm going to forget their names. There was Osnat Barzilai in, does anyone remember where she was? I don't remember off the top of my head. I have to go back to my other presentation and look. And we studied the Rabbi of Lubner.
Was she from Lithuania?
Barzilai, maybe. I can go back and check at some point.
It's okay.
Yeah, while someone's talking, I'll go look and then I'll be like, guess what I just learned? Just kidding, I would never do that. But these three were women who filled rabbinic roles. And as we looked at last time, and we talked about what really makes a rabbi, in some ways we can consider them rabbis because of many of the functions that they filled, but what they didn't have, and I think that part of what we acknowledged last time, we talked about how ordination of a rabbi is kind of a designation that is given by another rabbi. And we talked about how when I was ordained as a rabbi, I got a kiss on the kepi from Rabbi Ellenson. And that was the moment after a certain amount of study and work and practice that, in a more institutionalized way, that's how I became a rabbi. There's also private ordination that sometimes happens when you've been studying with one particular rabbi, and we'll look at a little bit of that today. But I think part of what we're looking for, part of what matters in the designation of what makes a rabbi is acknowledgement from your community that you fill that function, that there has to be acceptance of your role and an understanding of your role in the community. And I think that what we saw with these three women is that maybe in some ways they filled that role, but in other ways, it was not yet even understood that a woman could fill the role of a rabbi. And so how could the community bestow that designation upon her if the community isn't ready to see that yet? So what we'll start to look at today is the first two women who were bestowed that designation, both from in an official capacity and by the community at large. But before we jump into that, any reflections on last week or anything you were thinking about, or if you have questions, I can try to answer them or we can look them up together. Anything that you were reflecting on from last time? Fantastic, you're making it very, very easy for me. All right, so let's jump in. Are we ready? Okay, oh, I lost you. Hold on, I have to find you again. Oh, I didn't even share my screen, so that clearly didn't work. All right. It has been so long since Zoom was a thing that we did all the time that I am out of practice. Now you can see that, right?
Yes.
Good, there we go. Now I just need to make it so I can see all of you. Okay. So just a little bit of a timeline so that we can understand the times that we are talking about. What is the world that we are looking at? We are in the 1900s today. So a quick noticing of some key moments of the 1900s. So in 1920, the 19th Amendment was passed. What's the 19th Amendment? Who knows off the top of your head?
Women's suffrage.
Suffrage. The women's right to vote. So we're now starting to see movement in the world towards closer rights that look more like equal rights. Of course, not 100% there, because there's still a lot of stuff in the works, but at least we're starting to live in a world in which part of voting, participation in the process of democracy, part of what makes one count. It's like the minion of America, right? What makes one count as an adult in the eyes of community is the right to vote and have your voice heard. That happens in 1920. Also in 1920, and we're going to talk more about her in a moment, a woman named Martha Newmark, who is neither of the women that we are going to talk about today as the first woman to be ordained as a rabbi, but she asked to be admitted into the rabbinical program. And there was a whole lot of stuff that happened after she was asked to be admitted. And that's not a name that most of us know, and there's a reason why. So we'll talk about that. So that's happening around the same time. 1922, who was it that sent me an email about the first bat mitzvah? Was that Janie? Right, Janie. So we added a little slide for you here to look at that a little bit, because in terms of the Jewish world of what counts as equality, what it means to count as an adult, bar bat mitzvah is that moment in Jewish life, right? So 1922, we have the first bat mitzvah, and we'll look at what that looked like in just a moment. In 1922, also in 1922, the CCAR passed a resolution saying that women could not be denied ordination. Now, something to know about the Reform movement. You know that joke about 2 Jews, 10 opinions? In the Reform movement, you have a number of legs of the Reform movement. You have the CCAR, which is the rabbinic leg. You have Hebrew Union College, which is the seminary. So that's where people go through to get their education to become rabbis and educators and cantors. You have the URJ, which is the congregational arm. Eventually you have the RAC, which is the political arm. Oh, I was calling them legs, the political leg or arm, appendage, doesn't matter. All of these different pieces of the institution that work together to be the Reform movement. In an ideal world, they all agree with one another. But they don't always agree with one another. So while in 1922, the CCAR, the Central Conference of American Rabbis, decided that women could not be denied ordination, Hebrew Union College in 1923 barred women's ordination. So you had, even the movement was not aligned in terms of what was accepted and what was not. How that happens, I don't really know, but that was what happened. Just to put us in American context of what's happening in the world, in 1932, Amelia Earhart flew across the Atlantic. In 1955, Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat, and the civil rights movement really comes into full force. 1963, John F. Kennedy signed an Equal Pay Act. So now we're coming back around to women's rights in America. And not until 1972 was Sally Preisand ordained as a rabbi. What's your initial reflection, initial thoughts just on the timeline? Janie, go ahead.
So from what I gather about that, the HUC won over the CCAR, and it became a fact that women could not be ordained.
So the CCAR said there's no reason that a woman can be or can't be ordained, right? They kind of said it in the negative. There's no reason that a woman could justly be denied ordination. And then HUC didn't do it. So they didn't take the recommendation from the CCAR.
I'd love to have been at that HUC meeting.
And I understand, and we'll look at that in a minute, but I think there's a difference between the language that we use for this in like academia is folk and elite, that you have the stuff that the rabbis do and that the rabbis believe, but the people aren't necessarily aligned. And so this was a tension between folk and elite. Natalie, go ahead.
I was just going to say that it took 50 years, which is a heck of a long time, between the time the CCAR, the rabbis said they're supposed to be the supreme beings is with what's halakhically correct, between that time and the time that Sally was ordained.
Isn't it amazing?
A long time.
That's like more than my life. It's incredible. Susan, go ahead.
I'm shocked and I'm suspicious because it's really easy to talk and pass a resolution that women can't be denied ordination. But I'm thinking that probably the CCAR wasn't all that enthusiastic. In some ways, it's a labor union, and that maybe the presumably male-dominated CCAR wasn't all that dedicated to action and was willing to just, say something, but not put much action behind it. Kind of sounds familiar in terms of today's political world.
Sounds familiar in terms of today's CCAR too.
Okay, and so my initial reaction is one of great suspicion as to the sincerity of the rabbis in the CCAR.
Or perhaps the feasibility, of understanding what it would mean on the ground and being prepared to put it in action. Sam, then Janie, and then we'll look more at Martha Newmark. Go ahead, Sam.
Okay, as far as the women cannot be denied ordination, the Reform Jews as a group never did accept halakha as the law of the land, let's say, whereas the law of Judaism, so they could not use halakha as a reason for not allowing women to be ordained. The other one, 1922, the first bat mitzvah came from a conservative rabbi, Kaplan, who started the Reconstructionist movement, which is an offshoot of conservative Judaism, not Reform. So we have a whole thing with halakha and, and who observes halakha and the way it's observed.
You're exactly right. So the justification to do it or to not do it had nothing to do with Jewish law. That had to do really more with what we call the law of the land and what would pass and what would not. Did someone else have a hand up? Janie, go ahead.
So excuse my naivete, but the only place a woman can be ordained is the HUC?
At this point or
Yes.
now?
Both.
So at this point in 1972, Sally Preisand was the first woman to be ordained in any movement, and that was in the Reform movement. I was looking at a timeline yesterday. I think the conservative movement, around the time that Sally was ordained, the conservative movement starts to have this conversation, or this conversation. So the conservative movement is starting to talk about it around the time that we are doing it, whereas the Reform movement had been talking about it for 50 years. I believe the first conservative rabbi was ordained in the early 80s, but I have to go back. You all know dates are not my strength. I have to go back and look to make sure I got that right, but I believe it was the early 80s. Reconstructionist movement, I believe, ordained the first woman before the conservative movement, and the Orthodox movement did not ordain a woman until very recent memory. If we have time, I'll show you this very cool timeline I was looking at earlier that looks at all the different denominations and where their different milestones were. So also important to note, the flip side of what Natalie pointed out, it took 50 years and we did it first. So it is both earth-shattering and disappointing, all at the same time. All right, good. So let's just take a look at Martha Newmark. Isn't she I shouldn't say she's adorable. That's like the least feminist thing I could ever say. Doesn't she look strong? So she, like Cantor Barbara, who we met a few weeks ago, she was enrolled at Hebrew Union College as an undergrad. She was the daughter of a professor at HUC. And as she was doing the rabbinic studies, when you're studying at HUC, that's the classes that they offer. It's not like they're offering advanced mathematics. Like what she was studying was the same undergraduate coursework that the male rabbis who were enrolled as undergraduates were studying. And as they're starting to do things like get their student pulpits and begin to write sermons and lead prayer, she asked to be included in that. She's studying the same stuff anyway. And so here we saw the CCAR approved it, but the college disagreed. So Susan, this is a response to your question. The CCAR declared in a response in 1922 that women cannot justly be denied the privilege of ordination, having voted 56-11 in favor of that statement. Yet the board of the college still refused to consider women for ordination, voting, as Newmark recalled, 6 laymen to 2 rabbis against it. So the rabbis were against it, the lay people were all for it, but the vote of the rabbis held. So she ended up graduating from HUC anyway, but not with the rabbinic ordination that she wanted. Instead, and this is a theme that we start to see recurring in the Jewish professional world, that there is not exactly a tension, but kind of assumptions that are made between who is the one doing the educating and who is the one doing the rabbiing, where she ended up getting a degree in religious education and becoming a religious school principal, really laying the groundwork for this idea that women are the educators and men are rabbis, as evidenced by things like when my husband was in, my husband, his training is in Jewish education. We met when he was in school to be a Jewish educator and I was in school to be a rabbi. And almost every single professor said, what do you think they said to him? What was the question he was asked? What's your guess?
Who's going to take care of the kids?
Yeah.
No.
Why aren't you a rabbi?
Why aren't you a rabbi?
Yeah.
Did they ask the women in the education program why they weren't in rabbinical school? Rarely. But all of the men who went through the education program were asked in every single class, why aren't you in rabbinical school? So that still goes on. Natalie, go ahead.
No, I have a question because I want to make sure I heard you correctly. Going back to what it says is the CCAR declared, et cetera, voted 56-11 in favor of this statement. So the only people to vote in the CCAR are rabbis, correct?
Correct.
Okay. So 56 rabbis to 11 rabbis. And then it goes on and talks about the board of the college. So now we're talking the college. It looks to me like there were 8 votes against, 6 of which were lay people and 2 were rabbis, which goes back to Jane. I think it was Janie that said
I read it incorrectly. You're right. So it was the lay people.
Right. I think it was Janie, because stop and think about with all women and men. It's not just men, it's women who believe that women should be in the home and whatever back at that time. And men, they were probably less accepting of a woman as a authority rabbi figure.
Mm-hmm. Right, you're right. I totally read that and misinterpreted it. And what you're saying makes a lot more sense. And it goes back to that idea of part of what makes a rabbi is being accepted as a rabbi. And if the lay people were not yet ready to accept a woman in a rabbinic position, then it is reflected in the work of the college. You're absolutely right.
Thanks.
Thank you for clarifying.
No, I went, wait a minute.
No, you're absolutely, that's my own talking fast and reading comprehension skills.
And then I went back to, I think it was Janie who said that. And I thought, she's right.
Yeah. Good. Any other reflections? Sam, go ahead.
Yeah, I just have a question. In the Old Yiddish, a rabbi's wife has a title, Rebbitzin. Is there anything for a rabbi's husband?
Have you heard me answer this question before?
I don't think so.
All right, ask me the question. I'll give you my answer.
Well, I did get an answer from somebody once before, and the answer was lucky.
Yeah, that's the answer. What do you call a rabbi's husband? Lucky. Good. Or you can call him Josh. He goes by that too.
But there's no formal title.
There's no formal title. And if you ask my mom what a rabbi's wife is called, she'll not be very polite. She'll say Patty. She does not like to be called a Rebbe. Roberta, do you have a reflection on that? Do you embrace the title Rebbitzin or do you reject it?
Well, I never embarrassed people when they called me Rebbitzin.
You're better than my mom.
In my soul, I felt as though I worked and did my own thing. I was very happy as a Rebbitzin and to be married to my husband. But it was just a growing period. In the beginning of his rabbinate, people did that more often. And then later in years, they didn't because women became the rabbis. In fact, the other night, one of the rabbis who spoke at the National Association of Reform Rabbis, which I'm going to call not OR, that's the short word for it. When he retired from his rabbinate at the congregation, he was sitting with his grandchildren. And before him was a female rabbi that was the head. The associate was a female rabbi, and the cantor was a rabbi. So the child said to the grandfather, Zadie, can a man be a rabbi? So it was just the other, it just evolving in such and such a way. And personally, I think, I'm going to say personally, I think women do a great job as rabbis because they think differently than men. And my husband would say,
I think there are men that do great jobs, and I think there are women that do great jobs.
And I agree with Marty.
People have told me that I have a very strong feminine side, and I totally agree. And that may be why I feel that I was very successful. I know certain men colleagues who I wish never became rabbis. And I really haven't seen a lot of my women colleagues who I would ever say they shouldn't have become rabbis.
Name a few, but I won't do it right now.
Okay, well, I'm glad there are a few. But, so I think I think you find good and bad no matter what the gender is. But certainly I do believe with Roberta that men think in a certain way and women think in a certain way. And I think it's good to have both points of view.
That's why you want to be at a place like CBI where you have all kinds of rabbis. I did hear an anecdote from a friend recently who was applying for a job where it would have made her a rabbi on a team of women, and all of the clergy would have been women. And someone at the interview said to her, "Aren't you worried about what this teaches the little boys?" And what she was infuriated by is that no one ever really seemed to ask that question when the clergy was all men. So, I think we all make our way. All right. Anything else before we move forward?
I'm just going to make one statement about the line about Equal Pay Act.
Yeah.
So just the other night at this conference, Hara Person, who's the executive director of the CCAR, reflected on the fact, and she's a rabbi, reflected on the fact that there has really never been equal pay for women rabbis. It's getting better, but it's still not the way it should be. It's not equal.
This is very true. Sam.
Temple High has not had a male rabbi for a number of years.
Correct.
Right.
And they got a new woman.
Yeah.
She's going to be wonderful. All right.
Do you know her?
I do. We were, she was 1 year behind me in school, but she was in Cincinnati and I was in LA. And then because I did the education program, wait, am I sharing what I'm supposed to be? You're seeing Judith, right?
First,
yes.
Yeah.
Would you tell her that I'm a good guy?
I will tell her you're a good guy. We were ordained at the same time because I did an extra year for the education program. But we didn't really know each other because we were on different campuses, but she's great. We have lots of mutual friends. You're going to love her. Unequal pay based on gender exists in many fields, not just the rabbinate. I would say probably most of them is my guess. This does not mean, I think that sometimes when looking at the past, and we talked about this a little bit last time, that we have the tendency to kind of make judgments on what's happening and say, well, because X, Y, or Z wasn't happening, they weren't moving along as quickly as they should have. And I think in many cases that is true. But I also don't want us to think that there wasn't forward progress and that things weren't happening for women in the world of Judaism, because they certainly were. And one example that we have is the incredible example of Judith Kaplan Eisenstein, at the time known as Judy Kaplan, who was the first girl to become bat mitzvah in 1922. And as Sam said, she was the daughter of Rabbi Mordechai Kaplan, who was the founder of Reconstructionist Judaism. So it makes sense that he was doing something kind of cutting edge and that he was taking risks that others weren't, because that really is where Reconstructionist Judaism comes from. But this is a quote from Judy reflecting on her bat mitzvah. This picture is a photo of her on the 70th anniversary of her bat mitzvah. But would someone like to read what this was like for her? And part of what we want to notice is, while we call this the first bat mitzvah, what it looked like is not what a bat mitzvah looks like today. So we see, it's like one step forward, two steps back. Everything happens at its own pace. Would someone like to read for us?
I'll read.
No, go ahead.
On the Shabbat morning of my bat mitzvah, we all went together, father, mother, disapproving grandmothers, my 3 little sisters and I, to the brownstone building on 86th Street in New York City, where the Society for the Advancement of Judaism carried out all its functions. Women's rights or no rights, the old habit of separating the sexes at worship died hard. The first part of my own ordeal was to sit in that front room among the men, away from the cozy protection of mother and sisters. When we finished the Haftorah, a reading from the prophets, I was signaled to step forward to a place below the bima, at a very respectable distance from the scroll of the Torah, which had already been rolled up and carved in its mantle. I pronounced the first blessing on my own, Chumash, the 5 books of Moses, read the selection that my father had chosen for me, continued with the reading in the English translation, and concluded with the closing Barakah blessing. That was it. The scroll was returned to the ark with song and procession, and the service resumed. No thunder sounded and no lightning struck. The institution of bat mitzvah had been born without incident, and the rest of the day was all rejoicing.
So what looks like a typical bat mitzvah that we would see today, and what was different?
Okay.
Natalie, go ahead.
Okay, so I'll go to the most obvious one. She really didn't read from the Torah. She read from a piece of paper with the Torah reading on it, but the Torah was already ready to go be put back in. She was not over reading in the actual Torah.
Maybe if she had, then the lightning would have struck.
That's true.
I wonder if her 3 younger sisters were ever bat mitzvah.
Oh, that's a good question. I would assume so, but I wonder what it looked like. I wonder if it was the same as hers, or if maybe they were able to do a little bit more.
I was wondering how many years it took for bat mitzvahs to become a little bit more common, because it seemed to me, I grew up in a conservative synagogue, and there were no bat mitzvahs until at least in the 40s, when I was, of that age. Even though I was not a bat mitzvah, I don't think it was very commonly done.
I think you're right. I don't think it was commonly done for many, many, many years. I know my mother didn't have a bat mitzvah. Did anybody here have a bat mitzvah at 13?
No. I grew up in, sorry, Janie. I grew up in Denver, and the first bat mitzvah, I think, at Temple Emmanuel in Denver would have been one of my contemporaries.
So Temple Emmanuel was cutting edge.
Yeah, and it was? Okay. So that was in the 1950s. Yeah.
Susan, I see you have a hand up.
Yeah, I guess going back to this passage, she's not even allowed on the bima.
Right.
She's below the bima.
Right.
And she's at, as she says, she's at a respectable distance from the scroll of the Torah. So clearly not very inclusive. I guess they barely tolerated what she was providing in the way of contributing to the service.
Susan, that's what I was going to say. And I would add the word demeaning to that. I think it was totally demeaning that she was below the bima.
I don't disagree. I think it is demeaning, but just based on the literal words. Yeah.
It's, hard to know whether or not she felt demeaned by it. It's higher up than she'd ever been before, probably, or that a woman or a girl had ever been before. But I also don't disagree. Felice, go ahead.
I noticed the disapproving grandmothers. My folks belonged, although we were not religious, we belonged to an Orthodox synagogue in Far Rockaway, New York. And we sat separately and all that. And there was nothing about us girls. We never, not even a discussion about it. So we went to very big bar mitzvahs for the boys. That was a big deal, almost like a wedding back there. But I think, I don't understand the disapproving grandmothers, but that's all part of what she had to deal with. So perhaps being not on the bima was a relief for her. She probably was scared to death to begin with. So.
And just to imagine the difference between what it was like for Judy, who had literally never seen a woman serve in this capacity ever, never seen a woman read Torah, never seen a woman probably even lead a service, versus what it's like for our girls today who know that this is their birthright too. Natalie?
Yeah, okay, so I have a question. So as this reads, that somehow there was a Torah, and then we finished the Haftorah, but the Torah was already put away. So normally you read the Torah and then the Haftorah, right? And then you put
what I am assuming, and I wasn't there, so I don't exactly know, but what I am assuming is that Torah was read as usual, Haftorah was read as usual, and then there was kind of this addition to the service.
That's what I assumed, but I wasn't sure. I was assuming correctly.
And that also means that it wasn't the reading that counted. It wasn't kind of the official Torah reading.
Right.
Nancy.
Weird.
Oh, you're on mute, Nancy. Nancy on mute.
Thanks. I grew up here at Congregation Beth Israel, and girls were not encouraged. There was one young woman whose mother was the librarian, and she had a bat mitzvah, but it was very similar to what Judith's was. I mean, she didn't participate much, but no other women or girls at that time were bat mitzvahed. Now later on they did, but that was many years later.
Nancy, when do you have a recollection of when you first saw a woman doing something on the bima at Congregation Beth Israel?
Oh, probably not till I was married. Yeah, I don't remember it at all until I was married that there were women on the bima doing, you know.
Sam and then Janie.
I think it was in the 80s that I conducted the first bat mitzvah in a conservative temple. Until then, it was more like Kaplan's experience, where my daughters were like on a Sunday and they did the Haftarah, and that was about it. But later on, after the women were accepted as almost equal, and then I kind of broke ground, got help for it also from some people, that I had a girl come up to the Torah and read the Torah.
Nice job.
I was even able to teach her the Torah reading because that was mine.
Oh, I love that. And I think it's important to notice that, you know, we're going from zero, right? We're starting from women and girls not doing anything that looked like this at all. And it's like we had to go from 0 to 30 to 60. We can't go, they didn't go, weren't ready to go straight from 0 to 60. Janie, then Sharon.
It's interesting. I grew up in a Reformed congregation in Newark, New Jersey, B'nai Jeshurun. And boys were not bar mitzvah at that time. But the big celebration, if you will, was confirmation.
That's true.
And girls were confirmed, and the parties were as lavish for the girls as bar mitzvah parties are today. Boys never had parties. They came, but it was a girl thing. Boys and girls were confirmed together, but it was really a girl thing.
Sharon.
I grew up in Baltimore, and I was bat mitzvahed in 1960 in a class, which sounds more like a confirmation, but we were all in white dresses. There were probably 20 of us. And I vividly remember singing song after song after song in Hebrew that we had to learn. And there must have been some Hebrew reading. I didn't do it. Maybe somebody in the class did it. But, and then everybody went on to have their own little celebration, and it wasn't lavish. It was small, but in their own private homes. But it was a group class. And somewhere I have that picture of all of us in our little white dresses, and we got white Bibles, and we got white scrolls. And
you're definitely going to have to find the pictures for us.
Yes, I will.
But I think it's a good example of what progress looks like, you know, which is encouraging to keep in mind. And while we always wish progress could go faster, especially in retrospect, we wish it went faster. We have to acknowledge what it looked like at the time and that it was progress.
And this was an Orthodox synagogue.
Oh, wow.
Which is, yeah.
That's
right.
significant.
Right.
So I would like to introduce you to Rabbi Regina Jonas, who was the first woman that we know of to officially be ordained as a rabbi. So Regina, and I feel like I just need to tell you, because I need to tell you that when we once had a dog, when, let's see, like before I was ordained, and she died when Sela was 1, but her name was Regina Jonas Mason-Barkin. Because we knew we were never going to name a kid Regina, but we wanted to honor her. So we called her Reggie. She was very cute, and she would sit on my lap while I wrote sermons, and was a part of the process. So Rabbi Regina Jonas, another little story. So I went, when I was in rabbinical school, to Berlin, to Germany, on a trip that was designed and hosted by the German government. It was a trip specifically to bring young Jewish professionals to Germany to learn about what Germany is today and what Jewish life in Germany looks like today, kind of to start to change the story of post-Holocaust Germany to modern Germany, and to understand that Jewish life is alive and thriving in Germany today. And so we went on a trip to the Jewish Museum in Berlin. And it was at the Jewish Museum in Berlin that I first learned about Rabbi Regina Jonas. So it was not until I was already most of the way through rabbinical school that I even learned that she existed. That this was a story that was not told for a long, long time. So some points on Rabbi Regina Jonas. She wanted to be a rabbi for most of her life. And now, Sam, this is interesting. Her rabbinic thesis that she wrote was about the halakha of women in the rabbinate. So it was something that mattered to her. And they don't have movements, and they didn't have movements in quite the same way in Germany that they do here. They kind of had Reform and Orthodox, but there was still more of a melding of what the two looked like. For example, Reform synagogues in Germany had women's and men's seating. It looked more like an Orthodox shul does than our Reform Judaism. So she, some notes from her. In her opinion, a female rabbi should not marry, but every woman should be free to decide if she wants a life as a wife and a mother, or in a profession, according to her skills. In Jonas's opinion, women are especially fit, this speaks to Roberta's point, especially fit to be rabbis, since female qualities such as compassion, social skills, psychological intuition, and accessibility to the young are essential prerequisites for the rabbinate. So we see that it doesn't look like, and we saw this with Ray Frank also, that the idea of women working first had to be accepted in a setting in which women weren't also mothers. That, like what I do, or what Susan did, or what so many of you did, this idea of blending working and motherhood wasn't understood yet as something that was possible. We've broken all those ceilings. Good job, us. So she continued to lobby for ordination. She's teaching, she's preaching, she's doing all this stuff. And then Rabbi Max Dynaman, I think is how it's said, gave her private ordination. So it wasn't like she went to a school like HUC to become ordained. It was a private ordination where one rabbi bestows ordination on another rabbi. However, she was that piece that was missing from those women that we learned about last week. She was seen in the community as a rabbi. She worked in a chaplaincy context. She was a pastoral counselor at the Jewish hospital in Berlin. She preached at the synagogues in the areas. And this was especially needed as the deportations were beginning, and more men who were the known rabbis in the community were being taken away to the camps, that she was needed. It was necessary for her to serve in this rabbinic capacity. She eventually too, and it's a tragic story, she was deported to Theresienstadt, where she continued to function in a rabbinic capacity, but then was deported to Auschwitz, and we think was killed probably that day or the next day. Then the records of her, all of her papers were in East Germany. And that's why her story wasn't told for so many years, because there was no access. Nobody even knew that she existed. And so when Rabbi Sally was ordained in 1972, we believed that she was the first woman to be ordained as a rabbi. And it wasn't until the wall fell and we began to meld some of that history and read some of those documents that have been kept that we even learned that she ever existed. Lori, go ahead.
So I had a question. I think Rabbi Regina Jonas is a very interesting story, but why did it take so long? Because it says in the book of Numbers, the Lord spoke to Moses saying, speak to the Israelites and say to them, if anyone, man or woman, explicitly utters a Nazarite's vow to set him apart for the Lord, and then it lists what they should do, right? To things they should abstain from. So that particular vow, explicitly uttered, sets oneself apart by pronouncing it as a vow. This is what Eitz Hayim is how its commentary is laid out. But it basically is allowing a man or a woman to separate themselves by certain acts to be totally sanctified to God. So why did this take so long for all of this to take place? And maybe Rabbi Regina Jonas acknowledged that early on and was like, oh, this right here is my pathway. Why did it take so long if it's right there in the Torah?
So these are good questions. I mean, and in some places in the Torah, we see that kind of acceptance. However, you know, a Nazarite and is different than a rabbi, and like, you know, a woman could not be a Kohen in the way. But I think that what's more important to that conversation is the way that Judaism works in the context of the world around us, especially in modern times, that it's not like we're reading the Torah in isolation. I think that women's progress in Judaism mirrors and reflects women's progress in the world around us. And so until women were seen in leadership roles in Germany or in America, you weren't going to see it in Jewish life until we were seeing it in the world.
To me, it just clearly suggests that there is a way for a woman to sanctify themselves to God. So the path is very clear to me. I mean, to me, that would have been like probably like the red carpet, like, here you go, right?
Lay it out there. What are we waiting for? All right, I saw Sam had a hand up and Roberta had a hand up.
Yeah, I'm looking it up because I want to include her on the list. I teach a unit on Jewish women.
Ah.
Yeah, it's part of my Holocaust class.
Definitely.
And according to this site called Thriller, meet Regina Jonas, the badass first female rabbi.
I'll take it.
Okay, and there's a whole article about just about basically what we just said here. So
beautiful, yeah. So Thriller is a Jewish parenting site. I love that that's there. Roberta, go ahead.
I recall as a younger person that I was there one time, that the reason that women couldn't do the role that men did was because they could not come to the Torah when they were so-called unclean. And that was the major reason why women weren't up on the bima. Am I wrong? I mean, I remember this.
I think that this is a big part of it. I think that in a society, in a Jewish community that observes the laws of family purity, that is, you know, when a woman is menstruating, she is not permitted to participate in certain activities. And being near touching the Torah would be included as one of those activities. Now, in the Reform movement, we don't observe laws of family purity. So, you know, it would mean that after a woman menstruates, she'd have to wait 7 days and then immerse in the mikveh, and then she could have relations with her husband again and is considered pure. We once did a whole session on this in Torah study at looking at the intricacies of tahor and tameh, of purity and impurity, which was really interesting, and maybe we should come back to at some point. However, in the Reform movement, we're not observing that anyway. You know, it's one of those dismantling of the sacrificial system things that the Reform movement did. So so those rules, it's interesting that that's the kind of thing that would continue to have an influence, even when in other ways, the Reform movement is not observing laws of purity at all. But you're absolutely right that that is a big piece of where that stems from.
The Shulchan Aruch, most men would not be allowed to be called to the Torah either.
Yeah, that's, if we're really going to get into it and who's tahor and who's tameh, then I think you're absolutely right. Good. All right. Any other, here, let's see what we have.
Thanks.
Any other comments so far? No. All right, so what we were going to do right now is there's this little movie that we were going to watch together, but it's 10 minutes long, and that would take us to the end of our time. So I think what I will do is give you the link so that you can take a look at it, and I'll just tell you a little bit about it. So this is a picture of a number of women who are considered firsts. So this here, does anyone recognize her?
Sally Preisand.
That's Sally Preisand, the first woman to be ordained in America. This here is Sandy Eisenberg Sasso, who is the first woman to be ordained in the Reconstructionist movement. This woman, I believe, is I can't remember her name. I think she was the first woman to be ordained in Germany since Sally Preisand. And I'm not sure who the other two are. Does anyone recognize the other two?
I've seen the movie before, the little 10-minute movie before.
Yeah.
But I don't remember their names.
One of these might be Amy Eilberg, who is the first woman to be ordained in the conservative movement. I can't remember. So we'd have to watch the movie to see all their little name plates on it. But essentially, what happened in 2014, a few years ago, is that a delegation of first women, so a delegation of women who were the first women rabbis in particular contexts. So Rabbi Preisand and Rabbi Sasso and women who were the first in their country or the first in their denomination were all brought together to honor the memory of Rabbi Regina Jonas. And they traveled together through Germany and did probably some of the things that I did when I was in Germany, like visiting the Jewish Museum and seeing, the places where there's a shot of them looking up at the apartment building where Rabbi Regina Jonas lived and reading some of her papers. They met with an archivist and got to read some of her papers. And, there's a shot of them all with like those white gloves on when you look at old things and you don't want to ruin them, with the archivist. And then they also went to Theresienstadt and installed a memorial plaque and come back to to their home countries and continue the legacy of Rabbi Regina Jonas and keeping her story alive. So I'm going to put this link in the chat so that after the fact, you all can take a look at it. Screen sharing has stopped. Okay. So here's the link to that if anyone has 10 minutes later and you want to learn a little bit more about Regina Jonas. Any other questions or thoughts about Regina before we move on to Sally? Janie, go ahead.
I'm sad. I have been to Theresienstadt and nobody pointed out that memorial to me, and I certainly didn't know to look for it.
Was it since 2014?
Yes.
That is sad. That is sad. I wish that had been pointed out to you.
And I had a Jewish female guide there.
Wow.
Yeah.
So even with all that work done to remember her, perhaps it isn't even happening the way it ought to be. Okay. So we will next week have the chance to ask Sally our questions and get to know her. But a little bit about her. And what I'm really excited about is to hear how her story is similar to and different from Cantor Ostfeld's story. I think that Rabbi Sally went into this with more intention than Cantor Ostfeld did. It seemed like because Sally had already laid the groundwork and had already seemed to understand what it would mean to be the first and to take on this title in a way that it seems like Barbara didn't have to because Sally had already done it. One of the things that will be interesting to hear about from Sally is that Sally seemed to take the stance of Ray Frank and Rabbi Regina Jonas, not in the sense that she didn't believe that women could work and be mothers, but she kind of made a conscious decision to focus her life on her career. And she never married or had children. She has a dog that she talks about and sometimes is photographed with and considers her family. But to be the first, that was a sacrifice that whether she had to or chose to, a sacrifice that she made. So she was ordained in 1972 by the Hebrew Union College. She was a rabbi at Monmouth Reformed Temple in New Jersey from 1981 to 2006. I believe before she moved there, she was an assistant and an associate rabbi in bigger synagogues, but she had a hard time finding jobs. She had a hard time making a placement in because many congregations at the time weren't willing to take that risk. And she continues to work and serve, and I believe now is doing a lot of speaking. And Marty, having spoken with her more recently, might have more to add. But I did grab the screenshot of her inquiry letter, and there's a series of letters that I found that are going back and forth about her application. About, oh, well, do you know this? And you'd have to think about this. And then kind of this, there was like this provisionary acceptance that she wasn't going to be able to live in the dorms because the dorms were all men, and they didn't know if she was actually going to get ordination, kind of like Newmark, but eventually it was accepted. And so just to share this initial letter, we are pleased to learn of your interest in our college. Mrs. Weiss, our secretary for admissions, will be in touch with you soon with the information you desire. Women are welcome in any of our courses, and we would be glad to discuss with you the various programs in which you might be interested. Since you state in your letter that your interests lean specifically to the rabbinate, we would have to inform you candidly that we do not know what opportunities are available for women in the active rabbinate, since we have as yet not ordained any women. Most women prefer to enter the field of Jewish religious education. We would appreciate learning the name of your rabbi so that we may ask him to guide and advise you. Marty.
Okay, so an anecdotal story which Roberta can tell, but it is because of my living in Pocatello, Idaho, going to graduate school, and watching Rabbi Sally's ordination in 1972. And that's the year I watched it. There was a special on TV about the first woman rabbi, and I watched it, that my wife came home and saw me crying. And she said, "Why are you crying?" And I said, "Because I'm watching the first ordination of a woman rabbi."
He's getting
verklempt now. And she said to me, "Do you still want to be a rabbi?" And I said, "Yes, I think so." And she said, "Well, then go for it." So it was because of Sally, and Roberta has told this story to Sally, that I got permission from my much better half to pursue the rabbinate, which several years earlier, a rabbi had said, "I think you would make a good rabbi." And my wife said,
maybe with your next wife.
Maybe with your next wife, because I'm marrying an English professor. So it was all because of Sally that I was able to apply to rabbinic school, and you could say that the rest is history.
That's beautiful.
So Sally said to me when I told her this story, she said, "You need to write that up. It's to be in the Jewish archives." And I'm like, "Well, we'll see."
Well, now I guess you better do it.
I better do it.
And I love that as kind of the opposite side of the story of, what are the little boys going to think when they see all the women on the pulpit, and that you're a story of a man who saw a woman being ordained for the first time and knew even more so that this was what you wanted for yourself. I think that's beautiful. So in our last minute, any questions that you have in particular for Rabbi Preisand, so that I can let her know that this is what we're thinking about and where we're hoping the conversation will go? What would you like to know from her? I'm writing them down. Nothing in particular?
Okay, I'll ask a question because I have nothing to do. Okay, what was her most impactful moment?
And having just heard her speak, I think it would be really interesting to learn from her how she was treated by the classmates as she studied at Hebrew Union College.
Be well.
And then and then how she was treated by the faculty.
I'm particularly interested in that question in the light of the recent reports from HUC and the CCAR.
She mentions that in her talk, so she probably will. But she also mentions Nelson Glick, who was the president of the college, and how, I won't tell you what she'll talk about, but she will talk about him.
No spoilers.
Yeah.
Susan.
I think she's definitely will.
A corollary to Natalie's, I would ask her not just impactful, but what was the most gratifying experience and what was the most challenging in her rabbinate?
I was hoping you would ask her if we could have one of her favorite sermons to read before we come to the Zoom meeting, so that this way we could be familiar with her style of speaking and whatnot. Because I don't really know much about her, but if I heard her, I might have something more interesting to ask.
Beautiful. That's a great idea. I will ask her. All right, Irene.
I was just wondering how she might have been reacted to in her early years by fellow male rabbis, if she was accepted by them in the early years.
Oh, crap. So
I would wonder what was the impetus for her deciding to become a rabbi.
Ooh, maybe what might be nice to read is what she said at her receiving her 25-year, her doctorate of divinity. Maybe that piece might be interesting to read.
Okay.
That would cover like probably early on and middle and.
Great. These are good questions. I will let her know that this is what we talked about. And I'll let her know that we did talk about Regina Jonas a bit, but she might have more insight for us. So we welcome anything that she has to share, but I encourage all of you to take a look at that little movie if you have a chance sometime between now and then, and you'll see her speak in that film as well. All right, that just flew by. Anything else that you all wanted to bring up before we conclude today?
Sam, there's a great book called Great Jewish Women, and Sally is actually in here. So you might want to check this book out. It's by Eleanor Slater and Robert Slater. It's got lots of good information for your Holocaust class.
There's a lot of stuff online.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Especially the actress who developed Wi-Fi.
No. But let me see real quick if I can find that timeline for you.
Did you say a woman developed Wi-Fi?
She developed a guidance system for torpedo.
Wow.
Wasn't that Hedy Lamarr?
Hedy Lamarr, yeah. I won't tell you what her most famous reputation is for, though.
Here you go, Rabbi. I've got it.
If anyone has a moment to, you found it.
Yes.
I'll pull this up really quick just because it's so cool, and I'll show it to you really, really quickly. If you got to go, I understand. Here we go. Okay, can you see that? You can't see anything. There you go. So there's this timeline. So it starts with Rabbi Regina Jonas in 1935, and then goes through. So Sally Preisand was ordained. And like I said, the Ezrat Nashim lobbies for women's ordination. That's in the conservative movement. So that happens at the same, oh wait, are you seeing what I'm seeing?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, good. Sandy Sasso in the Reconstructionist movement. Oh, why isn't it telling me? It's not telling me the date. Oh, 1974. So she's 2 years after Sally. Now it starts Jackie Tabak. Oh, that's the woman who was in the photo. She was the first woman ordained at the Leo Baeck College in London, 1975. Laura Geller, 1976. She was my boss at my very first job at Temple Emmanuel of Beverly Hills. We have Julia Neuberger in 1977, also in London. And JTS, the conservative seminary, their first ordinee is in 1977. So I was a little off on the timing with that one. Then it starts to list all of the women. I love it that there was a period of time in which every woman ordained could fit on a timeline. Karen Fox, we met at our Yom Kippur afternoon discussion a couple of years ago. She's my rabbinic coach. I meet with her monthly, and she helps me be a better rabbi. But I thought the other important person to mention here was our own Arizona Rabbi Capel, 1981, ordained by the conservative movement. And she's on this timeline for being the first woman to serve as a reserve duty military chaplain. We don't see movement really in the Orthodox movement for a long time. How do I move this? There we go. So the first woman in the Orthodox movement, privately ordained, Mimi Feigelson, was privately ordained by Shlomo Carlebach. And the first woman that we see ordained in, who's this one? Oh, another private ordination. And here we see Sarah Hurwitz founded the first seminary for Orthodox Jewish women in 2009. And then their first ordinee is in 2013. So we're seeing progress, but it takes a while.
These Orthodox women, do they have pulpits?
I think some do. I think it has to be the right kind of Orthodox synagogue.
I can't, coming from the Orthodox world at one point, I don't understand how they would allow something like that.
I think it's probably a different Orthodox world than you grew up in that's allowing it.
Well,
probably modern Orthodox, as they say.
Definitely modern Orthodox, and probably only certain modern Orthodox synagogues, but that I can't say for sure because I'm not.
It would have to be the same kind of Orthodox that said it was okay forget about that, gets into politics.
Yeah, we'll save that for next time. All right, everyone, thank you so much. I'll see you next week with Rabbi Preisand, and looking forward to it. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.